So then we've been thinking about the theory, and now it's time to start looking at what practice looks like. But before we go on, I want to come back to this model of working memory, because it's really, really important when we're considering the use of feedback. Baddeley and Hitch's model in 1974 talked about these three slave drives. We've talked about phonological and the idea that that's the auditory information, and vicarious experience is very, very powerful in the learning process and the information processing process. And we've talked about the visuospatial sketch pad and how modelling and demonstrations are really important to the teacher. But let's talk about this funny word, this episodic buffer. Now, the episodic buffer was a process which was put in by Baddeley and Hitch in the year 2000. And the episodic buffer is all about creating, sequencing, and understanding where different features come in. Now, the episodic buffer is very, very powerful, particularly when we talk about things like mechanical modelling, or we talk about mechanical movement, or the teacher making the movements for the youngsters. So how could we start to show that within our teaching? One of the pieces of feedback that I'm going to give to you is when I'm travelling around the school 2 to 3 times a day, and I'm going around and I'm looking at lessons, my question would be, how often are we scaffolding the work for our youngsters? We're now in this situation where an awful lot of the setting might have been stopped because of the processes that we're in. So we've got very mixed ability classes. So it's really important that when we approach new work, or we're going over work in order to reinforce the understanding, reinforce the learning, that we've got that scaffolding correct for our learners. I think really carefully about another INSET that's taking place tonight, and I think about the Down syndrome training that's going on. Now, in the Down syndrome training, the Portsmouth Down Syndrome Association have sent us a toolkit, a toolbox. How often are we using those tools, not just for our youngsters like Eddie, who has Down syndrome, but how often are we using them for our autistic youngsters in the classroom? How often are we using them for those youngsters that have specialised SEND difficulties in learning? Our year 7s at this moment in time are potentially the most needy group of year 7s that we've had in, not just because of the situation that we're in, but also because of their specialist learning needs. So that toolkit doesn't just have to be used for someone who has Downs. It could and it should be used for youngsters who are struggling with our traditional forms of teaching, the chalk and talk methods. How can we get more episodic buffers in place? How can we ensure that our youngsters go forward? So that's my feedback to you. Now, teaching from behind the safety line. Now, this particular article was written by @Teacherhead, or otherwise known as Tom Sherrington. Now, Tom Sherrington is also the man who has inspired the teaching walk through us with Oliver Colavangiani, I think it is, something like that. I probably have said his name completely wrong, but if you've ever seen the work of Oliver Colavangiani and Tom Sherrington, yes, please have a good laugh at that. You will note that the teaching walk through us is an incredibly powerful resource to use. And Tom draws on some of the ideas from the teaching walk through us chapter on feedback when he's talking about teaching from behind the safety line. Now, the picture of the classroom that we've got in front of us, that's the picture that we all see. Our challenge is not to break that line. You'll note that there has not been anything in the handbook about crossing that line at all. It's important at this stage, in this situation, that we do keep our distance. And that's because we're spending significant periods of time in the classroom with our youngsters. So how do we get feedback when we're teaching from behind that safety line? Well, in terms of the learners that we've got in front of us, these 3 queries, these 3 questions, these 3 points need to be made. How are we going to engage everybody in the learning process? What are the hooks that we're using? How do we ensure that all the youngsters are switched on? How do we get real-time feedback about how everyone is progressing? What are the tools that we use? And finally, giving feedback to the youngsters, giving them feedback on how they progress, on how they move on, is really, really important. So first technique, first idea of the night before we move into our live session is this one. This one, I can now see Mr. Williams with a big grin all over his face because he loves this. This is the #1 tool for use with youngsters in terms of impact that it will make. And every faculty in the school have got them. Show me boards. Now, you might be saying, oh, yeah, I can't use those with a different class. So how can we use show me boards in different ways? Is it a case of youngsters showing fingers, indicating how well they've understood different concepts, being able to give answers to questions? Is it a case of having the show me boards out and youngsters wiping them down? Is it a case of using technology better? It's been noticeable since we've come back that the bookings on the iPads, that the bookings on the laptops have been far lower than they were before we went into lockdown. So my query and my question is to staff is why we're going away from those. Every teaching area at the moment has access to laptops. I think the only year group that doesn't have the laptops at present is year 8, but we can sort that. There are still iPad sets out there. How can we use the technology, Quizlet? How can we use Kahoots? How can we do that to check understanding and feedback? Second point is whole class feedback. This idea of, and I mentioned it earlier on, about not having to give 30 pieces of information, 30 pieces of feedback on every single piece of work that comes in. It's important that we as staff model this idea of work practice and reducing the workload. And I would implore everybody to look at how you give the feedback. How can we give whole class feedback? One of the ideas here is the use of the visualizer. Now, the visualizer can be used for you to model. It could be used for you to show somebody's work, to highlight where there are particularly good points. I think there can be a danger when we're working with youngsters who perhaps have a weaker piece of work of showing that on the board. So again, I'd employ staff to use the freeze button so that it's not coming up on the big screen, so that you can have a look at someone's work, so that you can see what's going on. I'd also say, in terms of the feedback that we do, are we using technology enough in the creative subjects? Are we using technology to take pictures of our work in D&T? Are we using it to take pictures of the processes that we've gone through in textiles, in art, in order to allow there to be a working diary of what's going on, of progress? So the visualizers are great, and they can be booked very, very simply by going onto the booking system, which is available under our Immunify as an icon, and clicking there on visualizers. The visualizers are kept. There's 2 visualizers for each bubble within the school. They're there and they're available to be used. The other thing that's great about the visualizers is they can be used as webcams, like this one is at the moment. So the visualizer is being used as a webcam and a microphone to see what's going on. So whole class feedback. Rose Hobbs did a very good INSET about 4 or 5 years ago about how she uses a whole class, 5-minute whole class feedback form in order to feedback to the class on the general things that were going right, the general things that were going wrong, where there could be improvements, celebrating the youngsters that have done really well. And that fits in nicely with Andy's phrase of let's catch the kids being good, as he would say. So let's celebrate those successes as much as possible. And in terms of vicarious learning, if pupils can model success, then other pupils are going to learn from them. Other pupils, it's going to be more of a powerful learning experience if it happens via a peer. And the final thing that I just mentioned to you now, and one part of this is the next little video that comes on and how to do this, is questioning. Questioning without any shadow of a doubt, if it's used correctly, is a very, very powerful form of feedback to the pupils, the students, but also to me as a teacher. I can see straight away where there are gaps, where there are perhaps if we use the analogy of a brick wall, where there's bricks where the cement isn't in place, where it's starting to fall away, where I need to make those repairs. So the first technique in questioning is a Julie Lancaster favourite, this one, cold calling. Pose, pause, pounce, bounce. Ask the question. Get rid of the hands up. If we want to be inclusive in our lessons, we can't respond to those hands up in lessons. Ask the question, pose, wait. Don't take the first answer. Don't even look at that child whose hand is about to go through the ceiling where they're jumping up and down, desperate to answer your question. Then pounce on someone in the room. Ask the question of that person. Don't accept I don't know as an answer. Give them an opportunity to phone a friend. Give them an opportunity to find the answer. Step away from them, go to somebody else and come back to that child. Then bounce that answer to extend it further. Check for understanding. One that I use an awful lot in PE is teach the teacher. Show me how to do this skill. What are the points you're going to make to me as a class? So I gather them around my 2-meter circle, around my safety zone, and I say to them, I've never thrown this object before. How am I going to throw it? Get the pupil, get the child to show someone else what to do. Get them to be the teacher. Listen for their responses. Look at what goes on. Is it a case of acting out? I'm hearing about this great example the other day involving semi in year 7, now 7 Andrews. Now, anyone that teaches semi, you will know how difficult it can be at times. Here's a child who will bounce around the classroom. Probably shouldn't be mentioning individuals, but I'm going to. And also Eddie was in the room, and this was a Latin lesson, and I think it was Olivia that was teaching the lesson. And I was asking Eddie about, after the lesson, about what he really enjoyed. And Latin came up straight away because of this memorable moment that happened in the lesson where Semi acted out what it was like in a Roman toilet. And Eddie was just in hysterics about this. And he could draw upon what was going on from the lesson, because it wasn't just about reading. It wasn't just about writing. It was acting it out, and it was being shown by one of his peers. So that feedback is incredibly powerful. It's incredibly powerful to the teacher to see that as well. And then the final one that I'm going to mention here is pair and share. Now, pair and share, we need to be a little bit careful with, even though we're in our bubbles. How do we do this? Well, I produced another little video, just a quick one afterwards, showing you how I paired and shared in an A-level lesson using the laptops. We've got to use that technology that we've had made available to us during lockdown. So Google Docs is incredibly good to use within Google Classroom, because I can say to youngsters, can you open this document? Can you open this one? Can you open this one? And they all have access to the documents, and they can share their thoughts on a subject with each other. So that video is coming up now. Finally, I look forward to seeing you at 4 o'clock, those of you that can make it, where we'll share our ideas, and we'll listen to some of the other ideas going on around the school. It could be the idea of the wave that I mentioned right at the beginning, the first session, the idea that each lesson, each row in the class moves forwards, so they're right under the teacher's nose. It might be the idea of a sharing table. Or there might be other examples out there of practice that's going really, really well in terms of feedback. So I look forward to seeing you at 4 o'clock. RM Unify, please make sure you're in your accounts. Google Meet, and the code is feedback. Feedback. See you soon.